So, good evening, everyone. Namaste. A warm greeting to all present here today for this session. I'm truly grateful to Khaki for giving me this opportunity to talk about a subject that transcends geography, politics, time, and a subject which connects the ancient soul to the distant land of Cambodia. India outside India, Angkor, an epic in stone, is not merely an idea. It is living testimony of India's eternal dialogue with the world. So today we embark a journey not just across geography but across centuries. We travel to a land which is not in India, which is in Cambodia, kilometers away from India, but in many ways deeply Indian. Imagine walking through a dense forest, air thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient secrets, and suddenly this stone spire emerges from the canopy of trees, towering, intricate, and carved in silence. This is Cambodia, where every step takes you to the whispers of Vishnu, Shiva, sacred rivers, and echoes the civilization deeply rooted in a Bharatiya thought. Today, we'll step into this legacy as a seeker to understand how a land away from India became a mirror of Indic culture, and how temples became the identity and soul of the civilization that still pulses into stone. So Angkor Wat echoes the name of grandeur, its mystery, its majesty. It is not just a temple, which you can see on the screen. It is a story carved in stone, a harmonious confluence of science, space, philosophy. So it stands there in Cambodia, but it breathes India. So when we look at this temple, it speaks in Sanskrit. It echoes the philosophy of Vedanta, and the bas-reliefs here narrates Ramayana, Mahabharata, and various stories from our epics. So when we look at this temple, this is a history in itself. So looking back, let's go back few centuries before and see how people shifted or how people traveled from India to different parts of the world. When India was not a nation state, it was a civilizational force, a force that expanded through vision, through uh, different wisdom, different systems, and people carried with them the scriptures, the sculptures, the narration, the different agamas, different shastras when they traveled from one place to other. The ancient seafarers of Bharat, they carried with them all this knowledge system, and sea was never barrier for them. Ultimately, this sea was a pathway for them to carry dharma from one land to the other, and eventually the land which is now known as Swarnadeepa or Suvarna Bhumi is the land which echoed, which absorbed this Indic culture, adopted the systems which were there in Bharat at that point in time, and evolved, developed their own system of construction called Khmer temple architecture. As we see on screen, this is a map by Ptolemy in 150 BCE, and this map also talks about this land as land of gold. Ptolemy calls this particular place as Golden Peninsula or Aurea Chersonesus. Now, this particular period, 150 BC, is also a period when this whole land is described in many scriptures and many travelogues as a land rich in gold, rich in spices, rich with lot of artifacts. And that is how this trade between India and China benefited Southeast Asia starting from 1st century AD. The surrounding kingdoms of Kambuja Desha or Cambodia, or even in Southeast Asia, very early Funan kingdom or Shenla or the mighty Khmer kingdom, Brahmadesh, Siam, that is Thailand, or Lavadesh, that is current day Laos, Champa, which is current day Vietnam, or Yavadvipa, which is current day islands of Indonesia, all of them absorbed and reinterpreted Bharatiya knowledge. They did not merely imitate, but they evolved with time, and eventually Bharat inspired them to develop their own understanding about different shastras, different architectural patterns, and they have their own technique of constructing sacred structures. So when did this happen? When the first story began? So this is a story of a Brahmin called Kaundinya, and we get this tale from ancient Chinese source called Liang Shu. The Khmer legend recorded the inscriptions and oral traditions through many sources. So we have many inscriptions in early period of Khmers or Cambodia, where we get these references of this story. And it says that Kaundinya, an Indian Brahmin, he was a learned man and possibly a trader also. He started to sail across Eastern Sea, and leaving this Coromandala coast behind, he reached to the shore of a mystical land called Funan, and where at that point the local princess Soma was ruling. So according to this legend, Soma was not impressed by this foreign visitor and she attacked his ship with her warriors. But eventually Kaundinya, with his sacred bow, gifted by a divine voice in his dream, repelled the assault. Struck by this his courage and aura, the princess Soma laid down her arms and offered him to marry her. Eventually, this story becomes the origin of the union of Kaundinya and Soma. But more than that, it becomes the mythical birth of the first Indianized kingdom of Southeast Asia, a union of Indic and indigenous world. And eventually, this place is now known as Vyadhapura. In the ancient text, it is mentioned as Vyadhapura, which is the first capital of Kaundinya Empire. And the Kaundinya dynasty ruled for around 200 years. Then there was another king called Kaundinya, who that dynasty ruled another 300 years. And this early period from 1st century to 5th century is called as Funan. And this record of Funan dynasty comes from the Chinese records. Now, after Funan, there is a next stage of kingdom. The neighbors of Funans were Shenla. They were also Hindu kings. But eventually, by 550 AD, Shenlas conquered Funan and they became a unified Shenla region. Now, during this time, we also see development of temples in this particular region. And they have a very peculiar style of construction starting from 1st century till about 6th century. Eventually, by 8th century, there is a king who shifted from Java. He unified the larger land of Kamboja, including current day Vietnam, current day Laos, Thailand, even some part of Malaysia and Singapore, some part of Myanmar, and unified it together, becoming a huge Khmer empire. Now, this particular period is a golden period for Khmers. And then again, after 14th century, there is a decline of Khmer empire and again, degradation into different smaller kingdoms as well. So this early period shows us a very distinct influence of Indic culture. These rulers are known as Fan rulers in Chinese records, and this Fan word is a synonym of Varamana, the honorific title which is also used in India by all the kings and very popular kings like Pallava dynasty. So the kings from those dynasties use this Varmana title like Nandi Varmana, Mahendra Varmana. So similarly, Fan rulers also use this title. Funan dynasty, Funan period, Kaundinya dynasty use this title. There are certain evidences from inscriptions which we get about their belongingness towards Indian culture, like use of Sanskrit language in the royal court. They follow Hindu religion. They have a utmost knowledge of astronomy. They have in-depth knowledge about legal system and adopted legal systems in Cambodia. They have a literature knowledge about Indian text, Indian shastras, even Indian epics and Indian plays. So they are adopting all of that in Kambuja Desha. And during this time, the land adopted a name of Kambuja by the name of Kambu Swayambhu, a king from Kaundinya dynasty. Now in 5th century, we get a very evident record by a king called Kaundinya II. This is second Kaundinya, and he writes in his inscription that I changed all the laws to conform to the system of Bharat. And this is a very evident proof that they wanted that belongingness towards Indic culture, towards Bharat, which was there at that point in time. So from Funan period, we get hardly any material evidences in terms of temples constructed or the complete temple as it is. However, we get some names from the inscriptions. And few of these traces could be seen in terms of broken walls of some rebuilt structures. But from Shenla period, we start getting evident sources in terms of temples constructed, in terms of the names of different temples, as well as locations of different significant temples in the Shenla dynasty. And these temples are important, significant for this period also because these are single cell temples. So these temples just have garbhagriha. So there could be one or multiple garbhagrihas in a precinct, but these belong to the system called ashrama. So we still date there are few temples. The name of these temples are like Ashrama Maharosai, that is Ashrama Maharushi. And these temples are part of these larger Gurukulams or ashramas of the Rishis, which were there, existed from 5th century till about 8th century. And then after 8th century comes the larger, a very glorious period of Kambuja, which is called as Angkor period, starting from 802 AD to 1432 AD. And in Cambodia, we get these dates extremely clear because we get these records from their inscriptions, and there are this clear-cut distinction in their history. There is a drastic change in history, their political systems from period to period. So after 550 AD till about 802 AD, the period is Shenla period. And then 802 AD till 1432, this is a Kambuja period or the glorious Angkor period. So what happened during this time is there is a king from Java, and he shifted from Java to Kambuja Desha, and he proclaimed himself as a Chakravarti Samrat of Gambuja, unifying Kambuja Desha with some part of Java, current day Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. So he unified it together, becoming making it into a larger kingdom. He conquered Kambuja and he became king of Kambuja Desha. So this is the place, Mount Kulain or Mahendra Parvata, where he proclaimed himself as Chakravarti Samrat. And today also this place is well celebrated, well crafted. There are very intricate carvings about Vishnu, Shiva, Lakshmi, and Brahma. So all of that showcases their adaptation of Indic culture through these stones which are carved there. Eventually, after this particular event, 802 AD, he also brings a cult called as Devaraja along with him. Now, this Devaraja cult is very unique. This particular cult has actually started a new movement of temple construction in Kambuja Desha. So here, Devaraja is Deva, that is God is king, and king is God, and they are complementary. So they work together. So this is important for them because for this new king, shifting his capital from Java to Kambuja Desha, for him, the social acceptance is utmost important. So this Devaraja phenomena helped him to establish, legitimize his power, his order into Kambuja Desha. So eventually we see that each king has his own Devaraja. So this system works as every king has his own Devaraja. This is like an object which that king is supposed to carry, which is a Shiva Lingam. And eventually when the king is in capital, that there has to be a temple to house this Devaraja. And considering the status of Devaraja, the location of this temple would be always on a very high loci. So geographically, it should be on a higher location. It should be at important location, visible from the vicinity. And they started constructing capitals around this Devaraja temple. So every king after 802 AD till 1432 constructed their own temple, royal temple for their Devaraja, and a city surrounding it, supporting the temple or supporting the rituals of the temple. And eventually we see the first capital, that is Mahendra Parvata. Same king, Jayavarmana II, he shifted his capital from that mountainous region to a more flatter region and very near to this Tonle Sap lake, which is the primary source of water in this region and the largest lake in Cambodia, Southeast Asia rather. So this proximity to this lake also gave them, benefit in terms of location, in terms of water management system. And this king shifted his capital to a current day location of Rolos. Historically, this place is known as Hariharalaya, and he constructs a royal temple there along with a capital called Hariharalaya. And there are multiple temples here apart from the royal temple. The next capital after this is Jayendra Nagari, which is very near to a region called as Angkor region, which is current day archaeological park as well. This temple is a following capital city. So after Harirala, the next capital city is Jayendra Nagari. Here also king modified the landscape of a place to construct a temple at a higher loci. But again, going back to the planning principle of a temple, which is brought or which is adopted from Indian system. Eventually, there are many such cities like Ishwarapura, Lingapura, Anandadityapura. So there are many such cities, more than 35 cities, which we know from records and from archaeological excavations. And there are more than 120 temples, which are royal temples, which are still there, explored over a period of time in the Angkor region that you are looking at right now in the map. So eventually, after Jayendra Nagari, after Ishwarapura, the following kings started coming back to the location of Jayendra Nagari, and the capital they constructed was called as Yashodharapura for a long time. So many kings came and they reconstructed Yashodharapura again and again on the same footprint of this region called Jayendra Nagari. Now, after this period, even if we look at, the geographical location of this, they are kilometers away from each other, but they have a very stringent inclination towards the planning principles which are adopted. So when we look at Hariharalaya or the larger region of Angkor, their huge water management systems, huge barai or water tanks, all of that are exactly on cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and there is no change in the inclination or, there is no slight deviation in the angle. So they are perfectly rectangle at 90 degree to the cardinal direction, and they are kilometers away from each other. And following same principles that are followed in India in ancient times, starting from 8th century till about 13th century. This area is huge. Just imagine a size of 400 square kilometers of land filled with different temples with water bodies like West Barai, East Barai, which you can see on map. These are 8 kilometers by 2 kilometers of water bodies. There are many huge structures, temples constructed. Rolos group is almost 40 kilometers from Angkor region, but all of them are perfect rectangles, squares, following same directions, and they are all aligned towards either the temples are aligned towards either east or west direction. And when we look at it in totality, we understand their belongingness, their dedication towards the planning principles that are followed or that are established in the larger cultural region of Bharat. Eventually, we see that these are different sections which are still there, and these are part of archaeological park today. So Rolos group, then western and eastern part of archaeological park together constituting around 400 square kilometers of land. So this particular planning principle that I was talking about, this is a conjectural plan. So the temple stands in between. So this temple is the start point of this city, enclosed with multiple moats, water bodies surrounding the temple complex. Now temples are perfect square temples. So they have these square water bodies around them, either 2, 3, 5, depending on whatever is the scale of the capital. They have this north, south, east, west axis defined. On that, the next periphery, next layer of city is ashramas and quarters. And on the northwestern quarter, they will have royal palaces. And on the southern part, they will have ashramas and quarters for the Brahmins and royal people. The next layer of the city is houses and rice fields. And then the city is again enclosed with a moat. Now, this moat is a protecting layer as well as part of their water management system. And on the northern side of every city would be a water body called as Barai. And in ancient times, in historic times, it is called as Tataka. So we see many water bodies, say Jaya Tataka, Indra Tataka, or such names given Indra Tataka given to the city as well as to the water body. So Indrapura has Indra Tataka, or any such city like Jayendra Nagari will have Jaya Tataka. So these are Sanskrit names which they have adopted. They are still using these names as names of these water bodies. So this now this is one prototype, and this is repeated again and again in Angkor Thom region, Rolos group. And that's why we see in Angkor region this kind of a setup now. This is the context of a temple. This is Hariharalaya. This is Nom Bekan. And now when you look at this, even today, This is the royal temple. There are these enclosure walls around here. So this is the first enclosure wall. This is second enclosure wall. There are these. This is the first moat. This is the second moat, which is now almost encroached or used by people for the settlement. But eventually, if you look at these roads, they are still the same ancient roads on cardinal directions. So earlier cities also used these roads, and in between there were the royal quarters, royal palaces, different quarters for ashramas. So all of that was part of this huge city, and these cities were measuring from 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers up to 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. So this city is only catering to the temple. So these are like temple cities that we have in India. And then we see many such temples getting constructed in Cambodia. They have experimented with material, they've experimented with construction technique, they've experimented with composite material. Like in this particular temple, this is Prasad Kravan. And you can see they have carved on the brick temples, brick wall, which is a difficult technique to carve because these are not molded bricks. Bricks are not molded to certain shape and then assembled on site. Wall is constructed and then this is carved, which is very difficult because if there is a slightest of the error, the whole thing is a waste. And that is their way of looking at things. Then this is another example. This is Bantesrai temple, constructed in 960 AD. Now this particular temple is very unique in itself because they have these concentric walls, they have moats, but apart from that, this temple is divided into two parts. On the east-west axis, the southern quarter, this quarter is dedicated to Shiva, and this quarter is dedicated to Vishnu. Now, apart from all those architectural details and the larger planning principle, this experiments a different concept of Hari Haralaya or Harihara, because this same temple now constitutes the Shiva as well as Vishnu. So the half of this temple, all the iconography is dedicated to Shaivism, and right hand side showcases stories from Vaishnavism. And the central axis shows the neutral gods like Indra, Yama, Lakshmi. So this is the axis that they have used. And now this particular temple was constructed by the priest of Ishanapura, and he constructed this temple so that Vedas and Vedangas could be taught to the next generation along with the prince, the current prince, as well as his friends and other Brahmin people in the vicinity. And this was a huge Veda Shala during this time. And we get a lot of evidences that people traveled from Dravida Desha, that is southern part of India, and they went to Bantesrai area, current day Bantesrai area or Ishwarapura, and constructed this temple. So very unique kind of experimentations they are working on during this time. These are the intricate carvings from Bantesrai temple, beautiful stories carved on temple. This is Ravananugraha story, which is very popular in India. This is the level of carving that they are working on in 9th century. And then while looking at all these 120 structures, when I documented it during my PhD, I realized that they have followed, they have reached after a certain experimentation, they have reached to a level to create certain prototypes of temples. So they followed a particular style of temple, reached to the epitome of it, and then there is another experimentation going on simultaneously. So this is a temple called Bapon. This temple is a different plan or design in itself because it is a pyramidical temple. As you can see, there are steps, and these steps here they are adorned with these cloisters or prakaram in Indian context. These are gopurams of the temple, and then on top of it, the topmost layer of this pyramid, stepped pyramid, there is a cloister, a prakaram, last layer of prakaram, and there would be garbhagriha here. And again, in the vicinity of the enclosure walls, you can see these two structures here, which are called libraries. And there are other spaces here, which are constructed as garbhagriha of different deities. And this library concept is, it is embedded because starting from 1st century, we see references of libraries in the context of temples. This is another prototype. This temple is called Preru. Here they have a concentric wall for the temple. There are two concentric walls. There was a moat here, but afterwards they have used this stepped pyramid. So there are these two steps here. And in the vicinity of this enclosure, you can see these elongated structures as library. And then these smaller shrines dedicated to different gods. On top of it, they have 4 shrines on 4 directions. In the center, on small platform, they have this small temple. Now, this is a Panchayatana kind of format that we see in India and repeated in Cambodia, using their own, amalgamation of style. This is a typical assimilation of Nagar and Dravida style of temple in India. So as if you remember, if you can relate it to Dravida style, it always has a prakaram. It always has an enclosure wall with gopuram, so which is also replicated here, implemented here. Libraries, again, integral part of the temple. But here internally, they just have one small temple on a platform. And the Pradakshina path or the circumambulation is here. The path is given on the platform, very similar to the Nagara style of temples. Just imagine Khajuraho group of temples where you are supposed to take a pradakshina or circumambulation around the temple. So very similar formats, few examples from that. The right hand side, this picture is Kokher, that is Lingapura. This was a capital from 928 to 942 AD. And now this temple is constructed as if it is a stepped pyramid. All steps are of same dimension. And on top of it, there was a Lingapura temple, Linga temple, Shivalingam temple. And that's why the name of the city is Lingapura. And this particular pyramid is again adorned with multiple structures on either side, following all the cardinal directions. So by this time, by 802 AD till about 10th century, what we see is these trade routes are also developing, they are flourishing. And because of the exchange between India and China, Southeast Asia benefited the most. They are flourishing, they are flourishing civilization. And along with this trade, there is growth of places, there is growth of different settlement, places, temples, wealth, exchange of new ideas. There is a cultural exchange happening from 8th to 13th century. And it shaped certain cities in both the regions. So it's not only in Cambodia, but even in India, we see this development through temple architecture. The prosperity that is, India is gaining during this period is reflected in the temple architecture of that time. So through trade, we also see that Nagapattinam, or there are some important ports in southern part of India, eastern coast. From there to China, there is a distinct sea route established via Southeast Asia and predominantly from Srivijaya dynasty. And this route is the most popular route from 9th century to 13th century. Now, during this time, we also see these kingdoms getting flourished, like Srivijaya, Panai, Kadaram, or Tamralipti. So all of these are here along with their rival Khmers. And Khmers are gaining a lot of importance because of their alliance with Cholas, their friendship with the dynasty over here. And there is an important event which happened in 1015 AD. Now, during this time, Khmers and Srivijaya, they got into a conflict. What happened during this time is Khmers became very predominant and they started gaining more and more importance. They started gaining control over a lot of ports which were under the Srivijaya's dominance. Eventually, Srivijaya attacked Khmer. They started regaining power on the ports which Khmers have already taken. And this started a war between Khmers and Srivijaya dynasty. Now, during this war, Srivijaya took help from Tamralipti dynasty. Tamralipti is current day Malaysia. So that kingdom helped Srivijaya dynasty to defeat Khmers. Now, during this war, Khmers took help from Chola dynasty. Now, in Cholas, this is the time when Rajendra Chola I started ruling the southern part of India. And during this time, Rajendra Chola saw this opportunity and he extended a naval expedition towards Southeast Asia. And during this time, Khmers and Cholas became alliance, and this alliance actually defeated Srivijaya and Tamralipti dynasty. And because of this particular event, Cholas and Khmers together ruled this area called, Yavadvipa, or all these smaller kingdoms which were there, and they gained control over all the ports and sea routes. Eventually became very easy for them to have trade with China. And that's how we see a immense prosperity in both these regions starting from 1015 onwards. So Khmer started developing their own temple construction, and Dravida Desha, we see these Cholas ruling from Tanjavur. So Rajaraja Chola, who ruled from Tanjavur, starting from late 10th century till about 1015 AD, and he constructed a beautiful temple called Brihadeshwara temple, the largest temple and the tallest temple in India. And eventually Rajendra Chola, his son, he conquered land up to Bengal. So he conquered Pala dynasty. He brought water of Ganga from there to Tanjavur, near Tanjavur. He constructed a Diu capital called Gangaikonda Cholapuram, which also means that the king who brought Ganga from there. And he also conquered Southeast Asia. So this is the region which was under Chola's influence for a long time after 1050 AD. So from 1015 to about 13th century, India was thriving because of this trade control on the trade route, sea route, their proximity and their alliance with Khmers, and their trade between China and Western world also. So India was at its peak because of lot of policies, lot of commercial policies which Cholas developed. And these policies also continued generations after generations. So following kings also followed similar policies to promote trade in this region. So eventually what we see here when we keep them in parallel, we see Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjavur getting constructed in 1003 AD till about 1010 AD. 1015 is that event between Sri Vijaya dynasty and Khmers, where Cholas took part and conquered the, the roots in and changed this whole geopolitical situation. He constructs Gangaikonda Cholapuram. This is the temple that Rajendra Chola constructed. And we also see cities getting developed, temple cities getting developed in India from 8th century. So these are earlier sthanams, important, significant spiritual places like Sri Ranganatha Swami temple at Sri Rangam or Chittambaram temple. All of them were there, but enlargement of these temple cities could be seen from 9th century till 13th century. And when we see the situation in Cambodia, this is the Chola Empire, and they have this proximity with everything, and they are now prosperous. Khmers are prosperous, and the king who is ruling here in 1015 AD is Suryavarman I. So Suryavarman I is the king who asked help from Rajendra Chola, and because of this, their victory over Sri Vijaya, he sent a chariot to Cholas, and that mention is still there in Chittambaram temple, where a gift from Kambuja Desha is mentioned in one of the inscriptions. This Suryavarmana king calls himself as king of laws. He unified the larger Khmer kingdom again. And during this time, he consolidated power, inviting more than 400 local officials from different regions of larger Kambuja Desha now. And he asked them to take an oath of loyalty with him. So this event happened in a temple called Bapon, which he constructed in his early times. And this place is also known as his palace. There are certain terraces which are just next to this temple, which are supposedly palace of Suryavarmana I. But even, through all these situations, all these events that are happening, he could construct lot of beautiful structures in Kambuja Deshas. And one of the important structures or important intervention that he did in the landscape of Kambuja is this West Barai, which is 8.1 kilometers by 2.1 kilometers, precisely done, excavated, handmade, kind of a water body. This is constructed in about 1025 AD, and along with that, he also constructed many such temples across the periphery of larger kingdom of Khmers. Then afterwards, there is a period when Suryavarmana I comes and he constructs Angkor Wat temple. But in between, there is a dark period for Kambuja Desha. So after Suryavarmana I, who unified the country, and that was a glorious time for Kambuja Desha. But after he died, there is another king who took over, and he could hardly continue the legacy of Suryavarmana I. There is another king who came in 1080 AD, Harshavarmana III. But there was a lot of struggle, internal struggle, which he had to face. And because of that, the whole kingdom was completely rattled. It was, weakened over a period of time. But the biggest blow to this civilization, this kingdom, happened during 1074 to 1080. Because there was an invasion by Champa, that is Vietnam. And this was such a strong invasion that they took a lot of people from Kambuja Desha. They enslaved them. They took them to Maisan temple, which is, current day World Heritage Site as well. And they also took the Prince of Kambuja along with them. And that is the biggest defeat in the history of Cambodia, which we see. And they also destroyed the Shambhupura temple, and a lot of destruction happened during this time. Not only structural destruction, but also psychologically, this is the darkest phase for Kambuja period, the Angkor period. Then there was king called Jayavarmana VII. He somehow tried to consolidate everything together, but he could hardly manage it. He constructed few temples here and there, but not very prominent kind of a reign. The next reign or next king who ruled is Dharendraditya Varmana. But this is the darkest period because by the time he became king, he's already 68 years old. There is no ambition. He has no will to consolidate anything. The whole Kambuja Desha was completely into darkness. There are a lot of, anarchy happening in this region. And this is the time when Surya Varmana II, who constructed Angkor Wat later, he is a small boy studying in Gurukulam, led by Divakara Pandita, his guru, and he's actually observing all these events in Kambuja Desha, and he takes oath that he will bring back glory of Kambuja Desha. So by the time he becomes king, it is 1113 AD, and he is very, very dedicated. He is, he is committed to bring back that glory. So he defeats Dharendraditya Varmana, his uncle. He defeats other rulers also who were in line, but eventually he decided to become king. He defeats him in a very quick war. Over elephant, and now he becomes the king. And the first project that he takes in hand is he announces is the construction of Angkor Wat temple. Now he is only 16-year-old. He's grown up in a Gurukulam of Divakara Pandita. His story is very much like Chandragupta Maurya, and now he is declared as a king of Kambuja Desha. The first and foremost thing is construction of largest religious precinct in the world. So he writes in his inscription that I want to the Angkor Wat, a temple called as Paravishnu Loka, is going to be the largest temple that nobody has ever seen. And even today, the status of Angkor Wat temple, as per UNESCO's nomination, is largest religious precinct in the world. So that whatever he committed, whatever he envisioned, is still true to its true sense, largest religious precinct in the world. So this is Angkor Wat, conceptualized on a concept of Paravishnu Loka. This is the concept of temple. This is the name given to the temple. And along with this temple, while he started conceptualizing this or announced the project of Angkor Wat, he has also visited many temples across the periphery of his kingdom. So he started this voyage. He visited many temples. He constructed a lot of, dharmashalas and different structures across the kingdom. He created some pilgrimage paths also to connect many important temples in the vicinity. He re-established contacts with Chola kings. He also given certain gifts to Cholas. He also established contacts with China, and he sent few embassies to China. And there are detailed records of how eventually, after around 10-15 years of Suryavarmana's reign, Kambuja Desha gained importance, gained supremacy in Chinese court. So they write about it after around 10 years of his struggle of establishing kingdom, consolidating the territory of the kingdom. Then we see these Chinese records where they call him a prosperous king. And till that time, there is a period of still, defeating the rivals and consolidating whole thing together. Now, this is Angkor Wat, which is now current day Angkor Thom region. So again, Yashodharapura or Jayendra Nagari. This is the region which is predominantly occupied by many temples together. Today, there are more than 120 temples in this region, and there are more because it's a dense forest and a lot of things are yet to be explored. This is Angkor Wat, just next to the ancient capital of Yashodhara Nagari. This is Yashodharapura, and this is Angkor Wat temple. In the larger context, it is just next to it. And when this temple was constructed, Angkor Wat was constructed, Yashodharapura is the capital city. And to connect Yashodharapura, he also constructed a small road, connecting road, which is straight from the gateway of Yashodharapura to the Angkor Wat complex. So when we look at the history of this beginning of Angkor Wat, he consolidated the kingdom. He started making alliances with the neighboring countries. He also conquered some part of Vietnam, Thailand, Siam, that is Thailand, and Kambuja, they are traditional enemies. So that event, this is always in conflict. Thailand, many a times Kambuja Desha conquered the region of Siam, and it was part of this dynasty. And after 14, they all disintegrated into different kingdoms. But eventually, Suryavarmana started with a large military operation. And at the same time, he is also constructing temples apart from Angkor Wat as well. So we get records of completion of Angkor Wat temple, and there is also record that 1177 AD, approximately after 27 years of death of Suryavarmana, this place was again sacked by Shama, that is Thailand, and eventually again the capital was shifted from Angkor to Phnom Penh. But somehow kings started reinstating power into Angkor region till about 14th century. But by 12th century, there was a this whole inclination of Hinduism shifted towards Buddhism, and the same temple worked as a Buddhist temple for the long time. Eventually, we get a record of some travelers who visited this temple. So one of the early records is by Antonio da Maldena. He's a Portuguese traveler, and he writes about this temple as it is such an extraordinary construction that it is not possible to describe it with pen, particularly since there is no other building like this in the world. It has towers, decoration, and all the refinement which human genius can conceive of. There are many such visitors who write about this, but the prominent visitor or a person who actually brought this temple to limelight for the Western world is Henry Moore. He is a naturalist, French naturalist, and during French reign or during French colony, he happened to visit this temple and he started writing about it in the magazines in France. And he writes that one of these temples, a rival to that Solomon and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place besides our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome and presents a sad contrast to the state of barbarism in which nation is now plunged. And this is this is a very colonial mindset or colonial way of writing about architecture, Indic architecture, I would say, for the larger region of India and Southeast Asia, wherein they always compare structures with the Greek or Roman style of architecture and demeaning in a way that, believing or making people believe that something such grand cannot come out of the people who are so in a poor condition. So that is how we see records getting developed in India as well. But however, French has really contributed immensely in restoring many of these temples. So they deforested these temples, they consolidated few temples. They've also diverted important funds for the restoration of this land. They also conquered a few of some land from Thailand so that they can conserve few temples which are Khmer temples, Khmer style temples. So this is Angkor Wat, which is the largest religious precinct, and this importance was known to people because people have used this for the long time. Unlike a Western theory that this temple was abandoned, it was never abandoned. We have clear records of people visiting it, people residing in the premises of Angkor Wat, and people celebrated various festivals in the premises, which is still true. People still visit them and celebrate festivals, important festivals. This premises of Angkor Wat faces towards west because it is dedicated to Vishnu. This is Paravishnu Loka, and Vishnu rules on the western part of the universe, and that's how most of the Vishnu temples would be facing towards west. Here it is true west, so there is no deviation in the angle of true west. The area of Angkor Wat, it is this external wall of the temple. The last periphery constitutes 203 acres of land, which is 82 hectares. And this is the last the enclosure wall or prakaram. Then there is a causeway over the moat. This moat is 190 meters or wide. And then there is a causeway to enter to the temple complex. This is the last periphery or the Gopuram wall, prakaram. Then there are multiple prakarams here. So this is one enclosure wall. This is second enclosure wall, third enclosure, fourth enclosure, and the fifth enclosure. So there are multiple enclosure walls, and each of these has this and there are certain dimensions given to this. So it is planned in a way that each enclosure has certain definite dimension measurements, and they corroborate, they correlate with Indian philosophies. So this is the periphery of Angkor Wat, 1.5 kilometers by 1.3 kilometers, then 190 meters of a causeway over moat. Then there is a free land of 30 meters. The internal wall, this wall along with Gopuram, this is 1 kilometer approximately by 100 meters. But after this area, after crossing this Gopuram, there is this huge pathway which takes us to this small platform. This is a plus shaped platform here. So this is a huge pathway here which leads us to this platform, and then the enclosure starts. After this enclosure, this is the enclosure wall. This is third enclosure, then second and the first enclosure. So this enclosure wall has, in between these two enclosures, there is this small space created through galleries. Now, in most of the cases, all the literature that you would read by the Western authors, it is called as crucified gallery. And in Indian context, when we look at it, and when I studied it during my PhD, I actually documented Angkor Wat in detail, which took me more than almost a year. And I actually drew this particular temple, plans, elevation sections, which we architects are used to do. So when I analyze this space, these are kunda or water bodies, which we see in all the Dravida temples as integral part of the temples. Now they have very formal way of approaching that space. So all these four are Pushkarani or Kunda or step wells or the smaller water bodies that we have in temples. And there is an arrangement done for water inlet and outlet so that water can be they can fill this space with water, and they can even free this space from water as well without having facing any water retention or any seepage. And just imagine the concept of Paravishnu Loka is Vishnu is residing in the Kshirasagara, that is the divine sea. At the center of it, he is residing on Shesha, Naga. And there are annular seas. So one needs to cross these annular seas to reach to to see or take darshan of the deity. So here what they have manifested it in architecture is they have these layers of enclosure walls. Just imagine this space, green space filled with water. So you are actually crossing seas after seas to reach to this Garbhagriha here. And this is also a representation of Mount Meru, which is explained in our Shastras as it is a divine mountain, a peak, a tallest peak, and surrounded by four smaller peaks. So this is the representation of Mount Meru, which is true in India as well. But looking at this is a very peculiar style that they have adopted to show water body in the temple. Now this is the second enclosure and the first enclosure. This third enclosure is world-renowned galleries, as popularly known as, and these carry the beautiful bas-reliefs from different epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, and many such stories from epic. So this gallery is what people definitely visit when they visit Angkor Wat temple. And this is the second enclosure, which again has some inscriptions and some reliefs on the lintel of the doors. And this is Bakan, which is the innermost part of the temple. And when you look at these spaces, they are gradually raised. So this space is lower. Then you have to take certain steps to reach to this gallery. And then this level is higher than this. So as you go inside the temple, you actually are also rising, or you are taking certain steps to go on the top. And by the time you reach to this space, that is the Garbhagriha of the temple, you actually climb 60 meters, which is as good as say 15-storied building. And you don't feel like it because it is very gradual and there are certain ups and downs in the stairways, and you reach to the Garbhagriha over a period of time, by taking all of these routes. And this is how this space looks like. So there are a lot of these prakarams in the temple. Then there are these smaller libraries, set of libraries in every enclosure wall. And this is the innermost enclosure where you have these four smaller temples and one Garbhagriha at the center of the temple. So this is the Garbhagriha of the temple, exactly on the cardinal direction, north, south, east, west, facing towards west. Now, when we enter this temple, the bas-reliefs that are shown, they are shown in a certain sequence. So one has to take that path to complete that parikrama or that, circumambulation to understand each and every bas-relief and then visit the inner enclosure. So the first bas-relief that one covers is the story of Pandavas and Kauravas. So that is the huge bas-relief. The second is Suryavarmana's story, or the historic gallery where his court and other warfares are shown. Third gallery is Heaven and Hell. Then Samudra Manthana, churning of sea of milk. These are important galleries because they are towards the eastern side of the temple. The next gallery is showing Krishna's war with Banasura. So Banasura story, which is not popular in India. We don't see it in Indian temples, but it must be very popular and significant of this society, for this society, because for this temple, which is now conceived as the largest temple in the world when it is constructed, Banasura story is selected to be shown on the temple. This is Kartikeya story, Battle of Gods. And the last panel that we see is Battle of Lanka. Now, very, simplistically, when we look at it, these are all stories of war. And these are also the stories of conflict. And this place is also a important university. When this is a thriving Kambuja Desha, these temples are institutions in itself. So they are teaching, there are gurukulams, there are a lot of debates happening in the temple premises. So this is a huge public space, socio-cultural space. And within that, we see all these smaller details which are, giving certain hints or certain education to people who are visiting this. So devotees are not just there to, take darshana of the deity. They are also getting educated while they are covering these parikramas, covering, spaces after spaces, because each space has certain significance and their relevance with Indic culture, their relevance with the Hindu religion, Sanskrit, their literature, all of that is taught, recited in Kambuja Desha during this time. And after taking these several, pradakshinas or, circumambulation, one reaches the Garbhagriha, which has 4 openings. One opening is towards west, which is the primary opening of the temple. And here was the important deity of Vishnu. This is the original statue of Vishnu, the Vigraha of Vishnu, which is very similar to the iconography of Pallavas. Apart from that, important aspect of this sculpture is the face of Vishnu is same as face of Suryavarmana. So in a way, this is his way of looking at Deva Raja concept, that Deva is Raja and Raja is Dev. That means when people are visiting the space or Angkor Wat temple, and when they are looking at the Vigraha of Vishnu, they are looking at King. King can be seen in the Vigraha of Vishnu, and when they are outside or in the, in the city, when King is passing by, they can see the reflection of Vishnu, which they have seen in Angkor Wat, in the King who is, ruling them. One symbolism. Second symbolism is the Suryavarmana dedicated a gallery for himself, showcasing or symbolizing that he has gained Vaikuntha, or he has gained that position where he could give a life like Swarga to the people around him. The Kambuja Desha is now living best of his life and best of his period. And this is the golden time for Kambuja Desha. And there are many such, meanings which one can draw based on their own understanding of Indian sciences, Indian scriptures, Indian astronomy. So Angkor Wat is full of such symbolism. And when we look at it in holistic, context, Angkor Wat is, it is amalgamation of smaller details, and at a larger scale, it also gets associated with other temples in the vicinity, Yashodarapura. And these are the bas reliefs. The first bas relief is Mahabharata War. As an Indian, we can easily relate and read these stories. When I visited this in 2004 for the first time, when I started my work here, I was completely unaware about this, but I could easily read it because we are grown up with these stories. So we know who this person is, Bhishma on Shara Pinjara or Shara Pinjara. And many such stories from Pandavas Mahabharata War, starting from day 1 to day 18. And these are episodes not divided by lines, but you can see those stories fluidly shown in a sequence of days. Then comes the next panel of Suryavarmana, which shows different important episodes from Suryavarmana's life, which he wants to convey to the people of Cambodia. And third panel, which is extremely interesting panel, is Heaven and Hell, Swarga and Naraka panel. And this is interesting because this almost 175 feet of length of this panel and around 20 feet height of this panel. Now they have divided it into 3 horizontal bands. The middle band shows Bhuloka, lower band shows Naraka, hell, and the top band shows heaven. In our Shastras, we get description of 32 hells and 37 heavens. All these 32 hells are shown in a certain sequence with precursor and post that event also. So it's like a story of one hell. For example, if there is a karma and there is a punishment given in hell, and that punishment is, say, burning in fire. So that whole episode of bringing that person to that fire and burning him alive, all of that is shown with those expressions, with those, that body language of those Yamadutas, and everything is shown and in continuity. So you don't see them, there is no break in between. It is going smoothly, one episode after other, 32 hells in a row. The central band is Bhuloka, so it shows all the karmas in Bhuloka. At the center of the panel is Yama. Next to him is Chitragupta. And very interestingly, they show a small staircase in elevation. So you just see those lines of steps from Bhuloka to Naraka. So Chitragupta decides the destination of that person. So either he will go to hell or he will be taken to the Swarga. So there, the line that is drawn above Bhuloka, in between Bhuloka and Swarga, there is a gap which is larger than the staircase, because you will be carried to Swarga. And these are certain smaller details. When one starts reading these bas-reliefs, there is immense knowledge, immense architectural and scientific knowledge which is embedded here. The next story which is shown is, it is like soul of Angkor Wat temple. Angkor is dedicated to Vishnu. Vishnu is a solar deity, and each and every aspect of Vishnu's philosophy is being encapsulated architecturally in Angkor Wat temple. This panel is the most important because it is facing towards east. Sunrays cast shadow of the column. There is a colonnade in front of this huge panel. So that casts shadow on this panel. Now, even this panel has a Samudra Manthana episode. So in the center, you can see Vishnu, Kurmavatar, and behind this small space that you see, each is Mandara Parvata. And on one side, it is Danavas, Rakshasas, and on the other side, you see Devatas. Another thing is, on Danava's side, you also see Bali Raja, the Bali who is king of demons. And on the right hand side, Hanumanta or Hanuman is shown as a protector deity at the end of Devata. So this is the end of Devata panel. And then there are other gods or the army of God which is shown. So this whole episode takes a certain space in the huge panel of Samudra Manthana. And all these images, those which are carved here, they have certain dimensions to it. And when we investigate it in detail, we realize that they are particularly prepared or placed in a way that the shadow is casted on that particular demon on a particular day, on the position that is expected, and that is the precision that is achieved in Angkor Wat temple. And they have certain relevances also. We'll talk about it in some time. And then other stories of war between Kartikeya and Asuras, and Banasura and Krishna. And then the last episode is last bas-relief is Ram, Prabhu Shri Ram with in the battle of Lanka. So it starts from the point when Shri Ram enters Lanka. So Ramasetu is not shown. Lanka war starting from day 1 to the last day where Ravana is killed. So that is this sequence that is shown here. And they have a peculiar way of showing Ravana, his chariot, and beautifully carved images of Ravana and Rakshasas also. Like I said, each enclosure has these libraries, which are, they have also, devised a way of dimensioning this. So there is a measurement to these libraries also. Each and every image that you see on screen, which is, measured and drawn on in AutoCAD, they have certain peculiar significances like intercolumnar distances, size of column, twin columns, so many smaller details which I could investigate during my PhD. And this is an important source where each and every distance that a devotee is going to travel is also recorded in dimensions. So one has to take that route in a particular sequence to complete that dimension to achieve certain philosophical or spiritual goals. And that is the intensity of construction of Angkor Wat that one sees in Angkor Wat. Like I said, this panel is very important, Samudra Manthana panel, and it shows 91 Asuras on left hand side of Vishnu and 88 and 89 Devatas on right hand side of Vishnu or the panel. Now 88, if we only calculate these, But if we add the central image of Vishnu, who is also part of Devas group, it becomes 89. And these depicts the days between equinoxes, winter and summer solstice. And when we understand these symbolisms, we realize that Angkor Wat is constructed as if it is static there, and the world is revolving. The solar system is revolving around this temple, casting different shadows on different dates on a certain in a certain pattern, with certain intensity at certain level. And that's how this whole temple is precisely constructed. So the exact match of the shadow formed by sunrise could give us the date and tithi of that particular day. So as per Hindu calendar, whatever important days that we follow could be identified and relate. We could relate it on site, looking at the shadow pattern of Angkor Wat temple shikhara and the bas reliefs that they have carved. And this is a peculiar event, which is people come here every year for to see that particular sunrise on 20th and 21st March, and in September again, but mostly in September because it's a rainy season. This particular event is visible only in March for sure. And sun rises from the central Garbhagriha Shikhara on 20th and 21st. And there are thousands of people who gather to witness this episode. And this is a live example. I mean, we don't have to read inscriptions and other literature which is given by different people. This is a live example where we can see how they have constructed it, and which still stands true. On the other important days that falls in December and June, the sunrise you can see it from the sideways gopurams or the shikharas. And there are so many astronomically aligned symbolism and alignments in the temple. These are very evident and very visibly possible. But when we look at it periodically, we see a variation in the shadows, variation in their pattern. And like I said, it is precisely constructed. So when we look at the larger perspective of time, that is yuga, each and every dimension is calculated and implemented in it. So this is the first causeway that we crossed, which has a dimension of 432 cubits, resembling its dimension or year of Kali Yuga. The second layer, that is that long passage without anything on ground, that's just passage, that is 864 cubits, which is Dwapara Yuga dimension. The third layer, center of causeway to the beacon, 60 meters by 60 meter with those four spires and central Garbhagriha. So up to that point, it is 1296 cubits. And the larger dimension is 1728 cubits. What it gives us is, apart from this larger, there are many such relations for each and every gallery that we cross in Angkor Wat. Every window, their relevance, their symmetry or deliberate asymmetry, everything is planned and implemented. Now here what it showcases us is, by the time you reach to Vishnu, by the time you are in front of Vishnu, you are in Satya Yuga. So you, after enclosure, after these dimensions, you cross Kali Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, Treta Yuga, and you are in Satya Yuga. So you are in your purest form when you are in front of Vishnu. And many such, events, many dates, significant dimensions, philosophies of Chandra, Surya, solar deities, they are all embedded in architecture of Angkor Wat. So though it looks like very symmetrical structure, very, if you have seen left-hand side of temple, you don't have to see right-hand side of temple. But there are smaller details which are manipulated deliberately to make it suit certain philosophy of numbers which are given in our Shastras. So when they have also played with it, so they have created certain blind windows, they have created blind doors. There are certain height variations which they have given to achieve certain height. So beautifully done temple. And when you know all of these layers of information, you can, visit Angkor Wat with, that intelligence or with that knowledge. And when you visit Angkor Wat, every step counts, every experience counts, because it is done with certain knowledge, knowledge of astronomy. Even the smallest of the details of given in the Shastra, philosophy of Vishnu, everything is there in Angkor Wat. It is adorned with beautiful sculptures, very prototypical windows, these railings, and there are more than 1,000 windows in Angkor Wat temple, all of them having identical railings. beautifully carved Garbhagriha and these Shukanasikas in a row. Beautiful temple with amazing details. It took 35 years to construct. Each stone was about 1.5 tons. It was brought from Mahendra Parvata, which is the first capital, and it was brought through river called Siamri. It reaches to this temple because Siamri flows just behind the temple. More than 3 lakh workers work on this site. There are 6,000 elephants used for the construction of the temple, but they didn't stop here. They implemented, or they started workshops for the next generation so that they could learn this technique of construction. And this project, which is, they knew that it would last long, so it took 35 years. So without hampering the social life of Kambuja Desha, without hampering festivals, their agriculture, their social systems, law and order, they have managed this project beautifully. And this is the best project management exercise which we could see in history, because the way they have handled it, the way they have changed many systems like agriculture, their festivals, they've also changed few days of festivals. They also commemorated few festivals so that people are motivated towards construction of Vishnu temple. So when we look at it, culture, society, administration, law and order, education, all of it put together, Angkor Wat is such an intense structure. It gives us so many references from history, knowledge of a lot of sciences which went from India to Cambodia, and their own way of expressing it through architecture. So as time passed, Cambodia started, embracing Buddhism, especially under the king called Jayavarmana, the 13th century king. But this shift was never rupturous. It was very gradual. It was like an evolution. They started worshipping the same Vishnu statue as Buddha over a period of time, but all of it continued to speak the language of Bharatiyatva. So there is no deviation. There is still this belongingness towards Indic culture. To understand Cambodia, it is to recollect the true legacy of India, one of knowledge, one of this vision of people, their bravery, their dedication towards sacred structures. Each and every step, each and every stone of Angkor Wat gives us a story of ancient land. So what is Cambodia for India? During this time, it is not a satellite like we see in modern day concept. It is a civilizational sibling. It is a larger cultural region which adopted, absorbed, and evolved with Indic culture or Bharatiya knowledge. The Indianness or this knowledge of Bharat was never a landlocked knowledge. They went with this knowledge to different places. It was always philosophical extension. It was a cultural extension. So when we look at the cultural regions of ancient India, we realize that there was this one thought about uh, the ancient knowledge system, which is, we call it temple, and they are all together because of this thought. So we see different temple types in India and their extension in Cambodia, which is called as Khmer temple architecture. A beautiful journey of temple from India to Cambodia. Today we speak about soft power. Today we speak about global diplomacy. Just look at this history which they have carved in stone for us to read today. It is enriched with knowledge. It is enriched with their experiences. And there is so much to decode in Cambodia, in Angkor Wat. I have been working on it since last 20 years and I have still not achieved anything. There are so many layers of informations in Angkor Wat temple itself. Forget about the larger archaeological region, but so much to learn from Angkor Wat. And I think this is where we relate to Cambodia today, which is our ancestral extension of knowledge, extension of wisdom, extension of our people who didn't limit themselves to the geographical boundary of India. They traveled with knowledge across seas. So along with this, I stop here. I leave it to you to explore this civilizational connection between India and Cambodia. Thank you very much. And like they say in Khmer, it is Akhwan Charan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I have goosepimples because you have brought with such beauty the the story of Angkor Wat to us. Your presentation was both, lucid and comprehensive and so well put together. Forget the subject itself, the presentation itself was done so beautifully. Thank you so much for that. I think I thoroughly, for the first time, enjoyed this journey and your narrative. There are some questions, and I know we are late, but I'll quickly run through them. Ramak has a question whether Kaundinya was a Tamilian. Is that where it started? Very peculiar. I think everyone noticed that both Vishnu and Shiva were mentioned, but Brahma is missing. Was there a reason? Was Brahma already not currying favor in the Indian context and therefore did not travel there?
We see Brahma sculptures there and few Brahma temples in Indonesia, not in Khmer region, but Brahma is very much part of the system there
Okay.
in ancient Khmer.
Interesting to know that each king moved their capital and moved their temple, so that it must be a sign of great prosperity in those times that they could do that, because good architecture will and movement like this can only happen successfully if they are very prosperous. Of course, a lot of people have felt, Rashmi and Meera have said that they've traveled there recently, so they've really enjoyed seeing this. Rashmi has a question. What was the purpose of the libraries and what kind of material did they have and who visited these libraries?
Library in this context in ancient times is very similar to what we had in India. So libraries, not current day libraries where we store books and there is a reading area. Library is basically a space where knowledge can be discussed. So these are the places where we have a system of question and answer in Indian system. Indian system of education is ask a question if you want to gain knowledge. So these spaces which are created, the outermost libraries, so-called libraries, these are the larger structures because people can witness the discussions which are happening there. And as you go inward, in the innermost enclosure, the libraries are the smallest spaces because these are for intense discussions between kings and the Rajaguru, that is Divakara Pandita, or any such discussion which is important for the close group. So the library, though the word is modern, given by the Western authors, these are like Yajnashalas, or these are places of discussions which we always had in Gurukulams. And I have also written a research paper on this, which is available on one of the websites. So you can just check this, the link for it, and you will find this research paper, why these libraries are integral part of Cambodia. And as I always, convey to the audience is most of it is lost in India because of invasion, because of our own deliberate attempt to, make it workable for the modern situations. Cambodia is kind of freezed. So you can see lot of ancient concepts in Cambodian temples which are erased in India. So libraries are one of them. So I think that is very evident to have libraries in temples, which we always had in India. Kerala temples still have libraries of, having those manuscripts and scriptures. Similarly, Cambodia also had a formalized way of incorporating libraries into their structures.
So maybe to discover our past, we all need to go to Cambodia and find that what we've lost here. Ramak has an observation again that Gopuram is a South Indian inspiration and the pyramidical structure is very much like an Egyptian inspiration. Did the inspiration travel from there, or was it their own, the pyramid structure, was it what they created?
This is a long timeline. So this pyramidical structure that you see in Kokher, which is very similar to Mayan architecture. If you look at Latin American structures,
Right.
in Guatemala or Machu Picchu, they are exact same geometrically placed as Kokher temples. So I would not say it is only pyramid used in Egypt. This concept travels all across, and we see their own manifestation of architecture into Cambodia. So they have experimented with many such prototypes, which only 4 of them have shown as examples of temples, but they have experimented with even the smallest details. So even the lintel that they are using, it grows with time. There are changes over time. So these are references taken from different places. These people are also traveling different regions. Indians are also traveling. So, there is a lot of this cultural assimilation that you see through architecture. So it's not just linear that Egypt and Cambodia or Egypt, India, Cambodia, it goes all across.
All of
That connection goes up to Latin America, early Mayan architecture. Mayan period civilization.
Jyoti has a question that Soma was already ruling as a princess. Where was she from? You started with Soma, so where did she? What clan was she, and what race was existed in Cambodia at the time?
In literature, it is given that she is a Naga princess. So she follows the Naga tradition, and Naga um, family is still very evident in Cambodia. So all the temples are adorned with seven-hooded Nagas at the entrance. Angkor Wat also has a beautifully carved seven-hooded Nagas at the entrance on either side. So Naga is there. Naga Vamshi is her description given in the ancient literature, and she is Soma from the local tribal community. So they have their own tribe, which is following the Naga worshipping, and Kaundinya marries Soma, and that is the first step where they get civilized. Because in the story, it is also written, then when Soma attacked him, she is not wearing anything. So once Kaundinya defeated Soma, he asked his person to bring a silk cloth from his ship, and he cuts it in between with his sword and wears it on Soma, and that is the description given as the Indianization or Sanskritization. Civilization started there. So Kaundinya taught them to wear clothes. That is the first evidence. That is what is given in the records. So Soma has, there is a detailed description of Soma as well as Kaundinya, how they are and how, what they have done even after this particular war, what their future generations, and all of that is given in literature. So we have enough data to know that she was from particular tribal community there.
So how did India, Ramak wants to know, why did India conquer Southeast Asia but not so much in Iran, Middle East, Africa?
The India never conquered anything, any places. It is always a cultural expansion. So we don't have a history of invasion. We have a history of innovation and exploration, and people adopted it. It was never a colonization. So we never made colonies going to certain places, imposing certain religion over there. And the region that you are mentioning was also one point in time, I would say, Indianized, because we see early examples of Surya temple in the region of Iran. And we know for sure that these were the places where Indic culture was predominant till almost 800 AD. And all of that got erased over a period of time. So now we have no architectural evidences of it. But through literature, through inscription, through a lot of these travelogues, we know that Indic culture was followed up to West Asiatic region, which is current day Iran, Iraq, Persia. So all of that region. Rather, Persia's name was Parshvapura. In ancient literature, it is Parshvapura. So it was there.
Ramak wants to know the triggers of shift from Hinduism to Buddhism.
That is interesting because Jayavarmana VII is the king, and he has two wives, and both of them are following Buddhism. Now, again, just declutter yourself from the current way of looking at these compartments of Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. These isms, which are given by, again, this is the colonial legacy that we are following. Buddhism, Jainism are not really isms when we look at in ancient Indian culture. These are cults. So Jayavarmana's wife, they are followers of Buddha, and the temple which is constructed by Jayavarmana VII is Buddha temple, that is Avalokiteshvara, the Devaraja temple dedicated to Buddha in 13th century, which is a current day Bayon temple. Now it is when I started looking at this aspect of intercultural or this shift, I realized that both of them are together. And now Jayavarmana is also constructing Buddhist temples, and these two wives are also constructing Hindu temples. So we have inscriptions about that. They both need these kind of setup because Jayavarmana, for all the yajnas, he has to have his wife beside him. So he has to, keep her happy constructing Buddhist temples. At the same time, these Loka Mahadevi and these queens, they are also constructing Hindu temples. And there is no striking distinction between these two philosophies. So when we look at these structures, we get the best examples of assimilation of so-called Hinduism and Buddhism in Cambodia. There is no destruction, there is no shift, drastic shift. Eventually, by 1992, they declared Buddhism as their royal, religion. But till that time, it was extremely fluid. There is no distinction. And when we look at it from today's lens, it becomes very difficult to understand. But they don't have these boundaries of Hinduism, Buddhism. So it's all happening together. They are
Adding to
all peacefully together.
the panel of gods. I love the concept of civilizational siblings. That explains it so much better than any conquest and, whatever. It's really like taking the Indian, and I think, like I said, we can really discover our history, our own history and past there, and their skill and, ability to carve is so beautiful that I think a lot of us can go and learn from them. There's a lot of compliments for you, but there is a quick question from Jyoti. What is your architectural delight in India? You've obviously explored so much in Angkor Wat, but what would you find as delightful here?
We have many structures in India which are beautifully done. Each structure has its own story. Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjavur is I think, a comparable example with Angkor Wat, because Brihadeshwara is also a perfectly constructed temple in the world. Not the largest temple, but the tallest temple in India. And when we apply all the principles, architectural principles, modern day architectural principles on Brihadeshwara temple, all of them are exactly implemented with utmost clarity in 11th century. And that is the beauty of Brihadeshwara. And like Angkor Wat, there are many layers of informations in Brihadeshwara temple also. So while doing my PhD, I actually compared many temples from Dravida Desha to Cambodia. And then finally, I compared Brihadeshwara with Angkor Wat. And that was enlightening, because we really don't, as an Indian also, we don't know about temples to greater depths, and that is at most required when you want to really explore your culture.
That's
So
so true.
Brihadeshwara is the temple which is comparable.
Is your temple. Archana Korea says, what script and language are the inscriptions in?
Early inscriptions are in Sanskrit. The script used is Granthi. So this is the Pallava script, early Pallava script, which they are using till about 8th century. After 802, say 850 AD, the script changed from Granthalipi to Khmer, and that is also a very gradual shift. Eventually, they are using Sanskrit but writing in Khmer. So most of the inscriptions that you get are written in Khmer script, but they are in Sanskrit language. So that is how they are to be decoded. So there is a huge project which happened for almost 20 years to decode these inscriptions also.
Wonderful. There's a lot of compliments for you in the chat, and a lot of people would like to see both your research and this presentation on our channel. I think it's been a delightfully rich and lucid presentation. So thank you so much for that. Very, very grateful for the good work that you have, good research that you have done and that you have shared with us. And of course, as usual, very grateful for our audience for both being here and for being so participative. Thank you so much, all of you. Have a lovely Saturday evening, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you, Dr. Ujjwala.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining. Thank you for inviting me to this platform. And
A
thanks
pleasure.
for joining.
Absolute pleasure.